It's almost impossible to talk about American history without looking at slavery. The slave trade and slavery became one of the economic foundations of the US throughout the 18th and early 19th centuries. But a growing anti-slavery movement created a huge political divide, which ultimately led to the American Civil War. Today, it's hard to imagine why anyone would risk their life to preserve the institution of slavery. So in this episode, we are going to take a closer look at those people and their reasons so that we can truly understand why did America ban slavery. Welcome to America, a history podcast. I'm Liam Heffernan, and every week we answer a different question to understand the people, the places, and the events that make the USA what it is today. Joining us from our faculty is Dr. Rebecca Fraser, a historian of 19th century America with a particular interest in the history of African Americans, especially relating to their resistance against slavery and the enslaved experience. Rebecca, welcome.
Hello, fantastic to be here and to engage in conversation about this particular topic, which is very, very sort of close to my heart in terms of my expertise and the books and the articles that I've written on it.
Yeah, so as this is your first of hopefully many appearances on the podcast as one of our faculty, do tell the listeners a little bit about yourself and your areas of interest.
Okay, so I'm an associate professor, which just means an academic, of American history in American Studies at UEA. And so my specialist areas of interest concern African American history in 19th century America, particularly concerning slavery and the resistance of African Americans against the systems of that institution. But also I've just completed a book on black female intellectuals of 19th century America, which looks at various black women who were kind of primary in terms of the fight for racial justice in that period, but thinking about novelists, thinking about artists, thinking about women who edited newspapers. So yeah, it's quite diverse in its reach. So yes.
Amazing, yeah, and we will put a little link to plug your book in the show notes so people can find it and buy it and read it and enjoy it. And full disclosure as well, I can personally vouch for your expertise, Rebecca, because I was your student back in the day. So, yeah, although I'm not sure how much that says about you, but I can certainly say you were very, very good. So let's dive into what I'm sure is going to form many conversations as we go through this podcast, because slavery, of course, is an unavoidable part of American history that has to be addressed and acknowledged and discussed in all its unpleasant and gory details. And one of the things that I think we really need to focus on is exactly how slavery came to be so embedded in America, and part of that is trying to understand what that pro-slavery mindset was. So let's go back to the start. How exactly did the slave trade become so huge in the first place?
Yeah, okay, so racial slavery, and by that I mean slavery from West Africa through to the Americas and Europe. It was first established on the North American colonies in 1619. So this is the British North American colonies. When the slave ship, the White Lion, carrying enslaved people from the west coast of Africa to the English colony of Virginia, landed at the coastal port of Point Comfort in August of that year of 1619. And the ship was owned by an English privateer based in the Netherlands. So already you can see the kind of the transatlantic element here. So this was an English ship The privateer was English, but he was based in the Netherlands, and the Netherlands themselves were major players in the transatlantic trade. And I think the need for labour was paramount among the colonists who came to North America. So the real engine behind the slave system and the transatlantic trade was economic, right? So this is not traders going over to West Africa with integral notions of racism and racial difference. This was about economics, the need for labour. And there were several systems of labour that really ran parallel to each other in these early years in North America, including white indentured servitude, so essentially white servants who were coming from Britain, particularly the port cities and towns, sort of Liverpool, London, etc. But they would be indentured for 5 to 7 years, and then they were essentially free. So there was labour for those 5 to 7 years, and then they would gain their freedom, right? So, and they would usually get a kind of parcel of land to, sort of farm, etc. This was very small in terms of, sort of the acreage. And then there was enslavement of indigenous or Native American people. But for a variety of reasons, this didn't prove financially viable over the longer sort of term. Indigenous peoples knew the land, they knew, sort of how to escape, but also because of the diseases that colonists brought with them from places like, sort of Britain and France and Germany, etc. Natives tended to die in quite huge numbers. So smallpox was, sort of a massive killer of native peoples that they had no natural immunity to. So with enslaved peoples coming from Africa, these peoples were purchased for life. So in a sense, this was a kind of the win-win solution for colonists. And we see the kind of gradual codification of slavery in legislation in colonies like Virginia and Maryland, whereby laws were passed that made slavery inheritable through the mother. If an enslaved woman had a child, that child would also be enslaved too.
Which then obviously massively incentivizes the slaveholders to rape their female slaves, because then it's free labour, right?
Absolutely. So they're gradually enhancing their enslaved populations through the rape of enslaved women. There were also various other legal codes that created definite markers between who was legally considered free, i.e. white people, and who was considered a slave, i.e. those of African descent. So that's how it really sort of starts. But we can't forget that this was a transatlantic trade. So there were major players in the trade. It did include Britain, and sort of Britain was primary among the transatlantic trade, but it also involved other countries, including Portugal, Spain, France, and the Netherlands, as I've already said. And they tended to kind of seek monopoly over the transatlantic world from the early 1500s. As we get, the kind of colonization of various new sort of lands and territories and conquest and exploration and such like. And these European nations worked in concert with each other, and other times in terms of, competing against each other. And there's no one, you can never really put an accurate estimate on how many peoples were trafficked across the Atlantic. Some people put the figure at 14 million eventually. So, because peoples died en route to, the west coast of Africa, taken from the interior, people died aboard the ships across the Atlantic. And don't forget as well that, as well as this kind of massive trade, there was also British cities growing very, very rich off the back of the slave trade. So Liverpool, London, Bristol, and even now we see the remnants of this kind of involvement, their engagement in the trade through the names of streets. So Slavers Alley, for example, or the architecture on the buildings. In places like Liverpool, you often see little African children holding up the pillars of banks, etc. It's got many, many peoples and many, many institutions already established, engaged in it. And this was not just an anomaly. This was a major trade that, sort of went right through from the early 16th century right through to 1807 or 8. So the British make the transatlantic slave trade illegal from 1807. North America, the United States, as it then was, follows suit and then makes it the transatlantic slave trade illegal from 1808. So that's under Thomas Jefferson's presidency.
So that kind of brings us on to then how the slave trade was able to really thrive in the US as its own kind of domestic industry. Because now that by this point it had been so firmly entrenched in American life, explain kind of what happens now. How does it continue to boom?
If we jump forward a little bit to the American Revolution, so we're moving from the colonies. America decides that it's really fed up with being taxed in the British Parliament and by the British without any representation in sort of the British government. And so it decides that it's had enough of this and wants to rid itself of British tyranny, and engages in the American Revolution in the late 18th century. And this establishes the first modern republic, United States of America. And racial slavery was very, very quickly confined to largely the southern states. So these states like Virginia and Maryland were once colonies, right, with slavery. But once they become states in the United States, they move from being colonies with slavery to pretty much slave societies. Their whole society is grounded around sort of slavery, their economics, their way of life. It's entrenched. That's not to say that northern states weren't engaged with the system of slavery itself. The northern states largely outlawed slavery in the years after the Revolution, and that was pretty much owing to their lack of a need for a system of agrarian labour as they moved much more towards industrialisation. Right, so we're talking about these two systems, economic systems. You've got an agrarian labour system mostly in the southern states, and you've got this increasingly industrialised economic system in the north. And so several northern states outlaw slavery pretty much soon after the Revolution. But that being said, places like New York and New Jersey do not fully outlaw slavery until 1827 for New York and 1845 for New Jersey. So, this is something that it's a little bit of a kind of a lie to say, well, sort of this was a southern institution and the north was based on free labour and the south was based on, slave labour. In addition, I think slavery is vital to the national economy at this point. So because the raw produce, so things like cotton and tobacco being grown, being cultivated, being harvested in the South by enslaved labour, and later sugar in Louisiana and other places in the southern states, they were being shipped to places like New England and the textile mills for eventual sale in the internal markets and export to Europe. So slavery is a national system that everybody in the nation, as long as you're white and free, benefits from. It's
interesting because I think it's easy to think that you've got this big north-south divide in slavery, and therefore that means the South are inherently racist and the North are not. But actually, from what you've said, it feels like it wasn't so much an ideological divide as it was an industrial one.
Yeah, no, absolutely. It was, sort of economic again, right? So it really did depend very much in the wake of, I think, the aftermath of the revolution, so the post-revolutionary period, on the ways in which the northern states differed in terms of their economy in comparison to the southern states. And because the southern states was much more rural, based on this kind of agrarian economy, growing rather than building and purchasing. So consumerism really took off in the north in a way that, sort of it didn't in the south. It did eventually, but it took much longer. So you're seeing a development in the north in terms of industrialization, commercialization, urbanization, sort of manufacturing used to take place as cottage industries, and then that moved into the factories, etc. Whereas in the south, you have a whole different setup whereby it's mostly work is going on plantations or smaller farms, and produce is being grown and harvested and such like. So it was very much a divide based on economics, really.
I think that says a lot, really, because I think that, there is definitely this misconception that actually anyone above sort of the north-south divide was against slavery, and that just wasn't really the case. If we put the money and the economics aside, why did people agree with slavery? Because we can look back on it now in the 21st century and all agree that it was inhumane and awful. And so why?
Yeah, why indeed? So I think what we have to remember when it came to racial slavery in the US, it was central to the foundations of the nation for several decades, right, from the Revolution onwards, and even before that, right? So when Thomas Jefferson, third president of the United States, wrote the Declaration of Independence, and the famous words of, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness," he was not including those who descended from the African continent in those claims to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Most of those descended from the African continent by the point that Jefferson is writing these words, subsequently, they were legally property. Enslaved peoples were property. So they were human chattels, so they were movable. They were akin to, sort of a horse or a cow that could be, sort of sold for a particular price. And the fact that so many presidents, from George Washington, first president of the United States in the late 1780s, right through to 1861, 12 presidents through that period were slaveholders, right? So, it's integral to the very foundations of the United States. So Washington held, I think, 300 enslaved peoples at Mount Vernon. Jefferson held around 200 enslaved people at his Virginian plantation Monticello, including Sally Hemings, who an enslaved woman who mothered several of his children following his wife Martha's death, right? So we have, sort of numerous enslavers as presidents after that. So in a sense, it worked for the South and for this kind of defense of slavery, because the fact was it was in their interests. It was in the president's interest to defend this system.
What I think is really hard to process here is just the level of hypocrisy especially when you're in government, you're a president, so you're championing this idea of this new way of governing, this modern society, liberty, freedom, opportunity for all, and then you go home to your slaves. How can you balance two completely polar opposite value systems?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and don't forget though, this was normal, right? This was a normal way of making money at this point, and the whole industry builds up around slavery, in the sense of, once the transatlantic slave trade, so the international slave trade, was abolished in the United States, this domestic slave trade takes off, and that involved selling enslaved peoples from the upper South, so places like Virginia and Maryland and parts of North Carolina and Tennessee, to the lower South, to slave auctions, to slave markets. So You're talking New Orleans, perhaps, or Natchez in Mississippi. You get a whole industry working. So there'll be slave traders, slave catchers, hunting escaped slaves down. You'd even get slave catchers who went up to the north and stole, free black people, so kidnapped them and sold them down south as enslaved peoples, which is exactly what happens in the story of Solomon Northup, 12 years enslaved. So it is completely normal, and I try to get my students to understand this, because it's so abhorrent to our 21st century sort of sensibilities to think, well, how is this even possible, particularly in a nation, the first sort of modern republic. It's espousing ideals of liberty, equality, freedom, but we have to remember that this is only for a very, very minute cohort of elite white privileged men. Those descended from Africa were excluded from those ideals. Women, they couldn't vote. They had no rights of suffrage until, sort of into the sort of early 20th century. They could not vote. They had no rights. They were indigenous peoples. There's a, whole horror story there in terms of colonists coming in and then settlers taking the land and then removing them to reservation after reservation. So the ideals of the United States that are, embedded in that Declaration of Independence are very much at odds with what happens and what has been happening in the colonial period, and then in the United States through the post-revolutionary period into the 19th century. But it's primarily because it worked in the favour of those who stood at the very apex of the nation.
So what we're, I think, clearly describing here is a nation that is at heart fundamentally racist, and that wasn't necessarily seen as wrong back in the 1800s. I mean, you could even use Lincoln as an example. I mean, he's the great emancipator, and yet there's a lot of evidence to suggest that actually he himself was quite racist. It didn't mean that he didn't oppose slavery, but he still believed that the white Caucasian race was superior to any other. Yeah. So what was it about the early 1800s that led to America banning slavery when it did? Because it wasn't this epiphany that suddenly actually we're all equal.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And, there was such an entrenched view that politically it worked in the favour of those who were in control, but also, sort of pro-slavery arguments were based on theology in terms of the Curse of Ham, Enlightenment theory, the likes of Scottish philosopher David Hume, who suggested that those descended from Africa were inferior to, sort of white Caucasians, and there was definitely a kind of hierarchy of man. And so the idea that, and then that turned into this whole kind of pseudoscience where you get Thomas Jefferson in the 1780s suggesting that the difference is fixed in nature between those descended from Africa and the white population in the United States. And then that morphs into doctors like Samuel Cartwright, who develops these kind of mental illnesses, and they're completely fictitious among enslaved peoples. One of them is called drapetomania, and essentially it's the desire for freedom among enslaved peoples, and he blends this with a kind of a Christian scripture, whereby he suggests that this is God's will, that enslaved peoples are propitious knee benders, i.e. they're born to be servile. So this is long in the making, right? The justifications for racial slavery. And so, but we do have on the other side of that this really kind of strong anti-slavery movement coming through. Men like Ben Franklin, who was actually who held slaves himself in the very early sort of period of his life, and then decided that sort of this was wrong and abhorrent, and founded one of the first anti-slavery movements in the United States. Primarily after the 1830s, you've got men like William Lloyd Garrison, the white abolitionist who was the editor of the anti-slavery newspaper The Liberator, who sort of writes passionately about why slavery is morally repugnant, but also you have those who have been enslaved and have either escaped from slavery or have been emancipated, and they're telling their story now, and they're getting their stories published through, you know, sort of the abolitionist societies. So men like Frederick Douglass and women like Harriet Jacobs. Yeah, I could provide you with a list of several black abolitionists and people who have been enslaved, who wrote their, you know, sort of stories down, were lecturing on the abolitionist circuit. Harriet Tubman, for instance, who escaped from slavery and then became a conductor on the Underground Railroad. So the Underground Railroad was a system of safe houses, really, from, you know, sort of the South through to, you know, sort of freedom in places like Philadelphia, and then on into places like Canada. I think domestically there's a big movement going on resisting slavery, but also internationally, I think places like Britain had abolished slavery throughout its colonies, so including Canada, including Jamaica, including Barbados, by the early 1830s. There was a growing feeling that this is it's an uncivilized thing to be doing, right? But also, particularly in places like Barbados and Jamaica, enslaved peoples are not sitting quietly, just contentedly getting on with their work. There's insurrection after insurrection. They're, you know, sort of creating maroon communities, but also they're rioting. And the same was true of the US, but on a smaller scale, whereby we have several revolts. Nat Turner revolt in the early 1830s is, you know, sort of the primary one everyone talks about. But there were smaller sort of insurrections and revolts, even on plantations. And white enslavers were paranoid about these sorts of things, you know, sort of because in many cases, enslaved peoples on plantations outnumbered enslavers, you know, sort of by quite a large majority. So yeah, I think there are numerous reasons why Civil War occurred when it did. We could think about, you know, sort of the election of Abraham Lincoln in the 1860s, but the founding of the Republican Party in 1854 with Lincoln as leader. And he was not, as you say, Liam, he was not an abolitionist. I mean, sort of that's clear. And this idea of the great emancipator has long been debated. But he was anti-slavery, right? So, and there is a difference. But Abraham Lincoln was married to a daughter of a slaveholding dynasty, Mary Todd, and she came from Kentucky, and it's well known that he helped various members of her family, you know, sort of he gave them protected passage during the Civil War through, you know, various routes. So, you know, sort of he had, you know, sort of conflicting sympathies, I think, but he certainly was on the kind of side of thinking about the systems of economics and developing, you know, sort of those systems in the best way possible. And it was seen slavery was an archaic, outdated system.
Yeah, and I think, you know, we've gone on a bit of a whistle-stop tour from the colonies right through to the Civil War, and there's a lot more that we need to be unpacking as we will throughout this podcast. But let's just entertain ourselves with a hypothetical to end this episode. In a parallel universe, if slavery wasn't as prolific in America, how different would America have been?
Yeah, I was thinking about this, and it's so difficult to say. I mean, sort of this idea of playing counterfactual history over, you know, 250 odd years, right? It's really, really impossible. So, and I think because race relations in modern America are the result of these histories of racial slavery from its very inception, from, you know, sort of the moment the colonists arrive on those shores. First slaver ship arrives with 20 or so enslaved peoples aboard from West Africa. It's written into the fabric of the nation, that development of white supremacy, that development of white power and privilege, that always means that whether peoples are, enslaved, or whether they are free, they're always seen as less than, right? And it's the same with very many other minority communities in the United States. If you're not a white man over a certain age, so there's a power issue involved. But Paul Gilroy terms racial slavery as in the Americas as the kind of dark underbelly of modernity. And this idea of supposed human progress. And I think that just about sums it up, really. And that has, I think, persisted. And you can even see it and apologies because this is a podcast about slavery in the US, but after the Civil War and in terms of Reconstruction, and then, sort of on into segregation and, sort of Jim Crow and, and then the kind of civil rights movement, we can see it in more recent events like Hurricane Katrina, for instance, or alternatively, the shooting of unarmed black men by police, right? So to say, what if slavery had not existed in the United States? I think it would be a different nation. I can't even think about what that might mean, really. So apologies if that's not, it's a bit of a kind of politician's answer, but it seems to me that it was so integral to the creation of the American nation. I'd like to think that actually it could be a history written without, sort of racial slavery, but I don't think it would be possible.
This episode of America, a History Podcast, was produced, edited and hosted by me, Liam Heffernan. A special thanks to our faculty member this week, Dr. Rebecca Fraser. And if you want to find out more about any of the topics discussed in this episode, do check out the resources that we've added to the show notes. If you like the podcast, please do make sure you visit our website. There's details on there about how you can get in touch and support the show. Additionally, please do also make sure that you follow and share us wherever you get your podcasts. And if you can leave a rating and review, that will help other people find us as well. On the next episode, I'm joined by Dr. Emma Long and the incomparable John Sopel as we discuss how a president's elected.